The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
Okay, let's go.
You're saying if you have a media machine that purposefully lies to its people to maintain a political fiction and get themselves power, that is the hallmark of an authoritarian system, not a democratic system.
Absolutely.
Well, if we were ever to get something like that in the United States, we would be horrified, furious, to know that there was an entire media organization designed to bend reality, to manipulate facts, to maintain power. It would, if I may, and I'm not trying to slam Hungary, it would never happen in the United States. It's just not, I almost can't even conjure it, imagine it. It must be very difficult to live in a country where one media organization, out of whole cloth, knowingly, explicitly, maybe even in meetings behind the scenes might say, we're lying to our audience, holy shit, and then call for news people to be fired for telling the truth. I mean, if something like that happened in the United States, it would be a dark day indeed. So I appreciate you raising the alarm bells for us.
All right, that was pretty cheeky from Jon Stewart. He definitely has his moments. You know, the funny thing is when I first heard that, honestly, I was like, who's he talking about? He could be talking about CNN. He could be talking about MSNBC. He could be talking about Fox. And he was actually doing an interview with someone in the Hungarian parliament. And so, you know, he was being coy by saying what he said. And at the end of the day, he was talking about Fox. And I finally figured that out at the end where he says, if you fire somebody for telling the truth, and then realized he was talking about Tucker Carlson and that situation where Tucker Carlson got fired a few months back. So anyway, I thought I would start out on that. Hey, everybody, happy Friday. Can't even believe it's Friday again. Seriously, these weeks go by so incredibly fast. They really do. But anyway, so listen, here is what I've decided to do. You know, obviously this Israel-Palestine situation just continues to develop. It continues to be incredibly complex. And you know, I talked to a few different people and I said, hey, are you burned out of hearing about this? Like, should I move on? And, you know, the feedback I got across the board was, no, this is super interesting. And obviously, you know, it's on top of mind and it's everything that's going on. But then, so I was like, okay, cool. But, you know, I realized what I'm going to do is I'm going to obviously keep talking about things and keep sort of bringing to light things that we need to understand. I mean, there's still so much to this we haven't even covered. We haven't covered what the Oslo Accords were. We haven't covered what the Abraham Accords were, which is what Trump instituted. We haven't talked about, you know, we really haven't talked about the West Bank to try and understand what's the differences between the West Bank versus Gaza. Gaza's getting all the press right now because that's where all the action is. But I personally have a feeling things are going to heat up in the West Bank a couple weeks from now. You know, I don't see this thing coming to an end anytime soon. And so I realize we have to keep covering it, but at the same time, there are other things going on that I think make sense to talk about. And ironically, there's other things going on that, you know, potentially could be related to this. And I'm going to use the word related in a very loose fashion, meaning more of a distraction versus anything. And again, I'm not saying what's taking place right now is a distraction because I would never minimize the loss of human life by using that word. But what I am saying is that as this is going on and all of our attention is pointed in one direction, there are other things happening in the other direction that nobody's really paying attention to. And I'm going to talk about one here in a little bit, and it involves, another shooting situation we had in Maine yesterday, Thursday, or was it Wednesday? I think it was Wednesday or Thursday. So anyway, yeah, that's basically what the plan is going to be moving forward. We're going to continue to, talk about Israel and Palestine, both the past and the present. But at the same time, I will start, layering in different things. Because like I said, and I know some of you might think I'm crazy. Some of you might think I'm sexy. Some of you might think I'm cool. I just dropped a TLC song in there for you. Go chasing waterfalls. I do think there is a bigger picture going on, and I don't have it all figured out yet, but I don't think what's taking place, actually anything that's taken place, especially in 2023, is in a silo, in a vacuum. And by the way, somebody pointed this out to me on Instagram. They said, hey, isn't it interesting that there's no mention of Hunter Biden? There's no mention of even Trump's legal cases have really kind of taken a tremendous backseat to any of this. You don't hear about that. You don't hear about Hunter Biden. You don't really hear about Ukraine anymore. Zelensky is probably not happy about that. But all of a sudden, that news story, which was so front and center really for so long, you don't hear anything about what's going on there. But then there's another $100+ billion omnibus spending package with a tremendous amount of money being allocated that is looking to get passed through. And again, we have no real closure on anything that's going on there. But at the same time, there's more. Now that it's not the focal point, again, they're sliding some things through. So speaking of that, finally, after a cluster FUCK situation in the House of Representatives, they finally elected a new Speaker of the House. His name is Mike Johnson, and he is a congressman from Louisiana. I've never heard of this guy ever. And so I was like, who is Mike Johnson? What is he known for? And so this is what I found. Shucky ducky quack quack. Mike Johnson is most notable in his role in devising an argument aiming at keeping Donald Trump in power, even though he lost the 2020 election. So basically, the guy's most known for being an election denier. Now, I'm not saying anything about that. What I am saying, though, is one of the main reasons Jim Jordan was basically denied was that they lumped him in the election denier camp because he was pretty vocal about that as well. But it sounds like this Mike Johnson guy was as vocal, if not even more, when it came to that. And I just did find it interesting that some guy, he wasn't even in the race. Like, I never even heard of this guy. I never even heard his name before until he won. And then here is his first speech that he made yesterday. And again, remember, you just got elected Speaker of the House, and this is the very first thing you talk about.
And we're in a time of extraordinary crisis right now. And the world needs us to be strong. They need us to remember our creed and our admonition. Turmoil and violence have rocked the Middle East and Eastern Europe. We all know it. And tensions continue to build in the Indo-Pacific. The country demands strong leadership of this body, and we must not waver. Our nation's greatest ally in the Middle East is under attack. The first bill that I'm going to bring to this floor in just a little while will be in support of our dear friend Israel, and we're overdue in getting that done. We're going to show not only Israel, but the entire world that the barbarism of Hamas that we have all seen play out on our television screens is wretched and wrong, and we're going to stand for the good in that conflict.
All right, again, I mean, the main thing I thought was odd was that that's the first thing he talks about with all the other major issues going on here at home. And then secondly, he says we're overdue in getting that done. What are you talking about, overdue? This just happened, 2 weeks ago. So I don't understand what the word overdue, why that was in there. And remember, the one thing I said about Jim Jordan that I liked that he was very fiscally conservative and, in my opinion, fiscally responsible. But now we've got, again, somebody nobody's ever heard of in that role, and it definitely seems like he's ready to play ball when it comes to spending of money. All right, think what you will of that. All right, getting back to the Israel-Palestine situation, I've been very fortunate to have some great conversations with a few of my Jewish friends that are super knowledgeable in this stuff, and actually they're able to kind of separate their emotions from the ongoing situation. Now, I have had a couple conversations with a few of my other Jewish friends who, again, they're not able to separate the emotions. So with those guys, I've just sort of empathized with them, and honestly, I let them vent and share what they want to share, and we kind of go from there. But there's two guys in particular that they are able to separate their emotions from things, and so we can really have like amazing unfiltered conversation, which that's where you get to the truth. And so I think I've talked in previous episodes. I mean, there's definitely a disconnect between Netanyahu and the people. I've had friends tell me, oh, we can't stand Netanyahu, but now it's wartime, and so they're rallying behind him. So I get that, but it's the ones that can give me the real skinny about, what they really think about him. And one of them said, hey, I could solve this war in 24 hours. I'd get rid of Netanyahu, and then I'd make a deal with whoever is in charge on the Palestinian side and get rid of Hamas, and then we would divide up the country in two, build some big walls, and call it a day. I was like, man, that sounds nice. I just don't know if that'll ever happen. And then we started talking about that whole Charlie Kirk interview, which, gosh, I can't even remember, but it was a couple episodes ago where he talked about, actually, you know what? Let me play it again.
We don't talk about Israeli politics very often, and most Americans don't know this. The last 9 months, Israel was on the brink of civil war. It's not an exaggeration. This judicial stuff, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets because Bibi Netanyahu was basically redefining the Israeli constitution. That's not an exaggeration, right? He said the judicial branch has too much power. There were protests planned this week against Netanyahu, where they anticipated tens of thousands of people to take to the streets. That's all gone, Patrick. Netanyahu now has an emergency government and a mandate to lead. I'm not willing to go so far that saying that Netanyahu knew or there was intelligence here, but I think some questions need to be asked. Was there a stand down order? Was there a stand down order? 6 hours? I don't believe it. Israel's the size of New Jersey. When I took a helicopter ride from Jerusalem to the Gaza border, it's 45 minutes. 6 hours.
By the way, I will say he took a lot of heat for that, and he has not revisited that topic since. And some of the things he's basically posted since, I hate to say it, but it looks like he's like, I don't know, making up for that. But man, that was call a spade take right there. That definitely was. So that Charlie Kirk take was on the Patrick Bet-David show, which Patrick Bet-David goes by PBD. It's a great podcast, actually. It's on YouTube as well. It's one of the things I don't mind watching the video format of. Anyway, so my friend said, hey, I know you saw that. We were talking all about the Charlie Kirk thing. And he's like, did you see what Vincent said? And I said, no. And Vincent Oshana is one of PBD's like guys on that show. And he sent it to me and he's like, check out what he said. And so I'm going to play that for you. And God dang, this is calling a spade right here. So give this a listen.
Israel knew Hamas would attack, right? Then they contradict themselves. They write an article the next day that says U.S. intelligence reports included warnings from September and October that the CIA and other Middle Eastern allies knew. They should have been on high alert. They were warned September 28th. They were warned October 5th. It's just crazy. Like, when are we going to stop pretending that nobody knew? And when are we going to hold people accountable? For instance, they asked John Kirby for the massive security failure. You know what his answer was? Now's not the time. Of course now's the time. We're moving forward. They're about to attack. I mean, dude, this is like a godsend, I guess, so some more children could leave. You know why they haven't invaded in Gaza, Pat? The weather. But like, decisions are being made, just like in when we invaded Iraq. We went in on weapons of mass destruction, war. Then we bombed the shit out of everybody. And then they're like, oh, by the way, no weapons of mass destruction. It's too late. And here's my question. Charlie brought this up, Pat. Is it so far-fetched? I'm being genuine, that a leader that's kind of, controversial, is not going that good for him, there's brink of civil war in your country, is it crazy to let an event like what just happened happen to unify everybody so nobody looks at you and they all look at the issue? And if it is true, I'm going to ask you, Adam, if it is true that this genuinely happened, they had intelligence, because the proof is in the pudding, it looks like they did, and they kind of went like this and let their people die.
That is definitely the most raw take I've heard on this. And listen, here's the thing. I mean, if you get triggered by listening to stuff like this, I'm sorry, but you have to listen to this stuff. You do. You really have to look at all angles. He brought up the weapons of mass destruction with George W., and I've played that a few different times. I mean, again, think about that. Via the narrative of weapons of mass destruction, that led to overthrowing Iraq, taking over Afghanistan, a 20-year war, and over $4 trillion of United States taxpayer money. Okay? 20 years later, Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban, who 20 years prior we took it from. They're back in control. And then Iraq is now closer to Iran in terms of their interdependence on one another. So think about that. If you really think about that, then you have to listen to takes like that. Now, again, none of it might be true. Who knows? But you can't get triggered by just listening to other things. All right, that actually leads me into a really cool thing that another friend sent me. So there is this concept called Economic Hitman. And I think it was born out of this guy's book, or maybe it existed and then he wrote a book on it. But it's from a gentleman named John Perkins, and he wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And in the book, Perkins described his experiences, and I'm going to read this to you, as an economist of an international consulting firm whose job was to persuade strategically important developing countries such as Panama and Indonesia and Iraq, and it all started with Iran in 1953, to accept enormous loans for infrastructure development, and then to ensure that the lucrative projects were contracted by the American firms that were part of this. According to Perkins, an economic hitman is a highly paid professional who uses fraudulent financial reports, rigged elections, payoffs, extortion, sex, and murder to cheat countries out of trillions of dollars. This next part is interesting because it touches on what we talked about yesterday with colonialism and imperialism. God, colonialism, I don't know, that's a hard word to say for some reason. Okay, listen to this. Perkins says that the imperialist and capitalistic drive is the primary cause of most wars, pollution, starvation, species extinctions, and genocides. So basically, he's saying money and greed cause all of our problems. And you know what? That sounds about right to me. Okay, give this clip a listen. By the way, I am going to do a full deep shallow dive on this, but let's get a taste of it right now because I think it is relevant to the ongoing situation. And so this specific clip, he's talking about Iraq.
Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, but he wouldn't accept it.
By the way, quick interjection. So this I knew, which is super interesting that he talked about it, but the reason Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman is like the man and they, their country is like insane after a very little amount of time and they have more money than God is because they played ball. They agreed to the petrodollar.
And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system. So in 91, we send in the troops and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time, but we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And that once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't. They didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again. So we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones.
Really quick, reconstruct a country that you just destroyed. Ukraine. If you've paid attention, you've seen Zelensky have meetings with the CEO of BlackRock and then tons of other very, very large private equity and money management firms, as well as construction firms here in the U.S. and in China. Think about that, seriously. Here it is from the New York Times. Zelensky, BlackRock announced new investment initiative to rebuild Ukraine. Global asset manager BlackRock will coordinate investment in rebuilding Ukraine's economy. Following a meeting between President Vladimir Zelensky and BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, the government confirmed that the Wall Street titan agreed to coordinate the efforts of all potential investors and participants in the reconstruction of their economy. As a result of the agreement, BlackRock will channel capital into multiple sectors of the Eastern European country's economy. You can Google that yourself. Just Google BlackRock Ukraine and you can read all about it.
So, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in.
All right, I'm going to cut it there, but Economic Hitman, 3 stages. Stage 1 is like the hitman, which he was. Stage 2, the jackals. Stage 3, the military. All those 3 things happened, and it wasn't just Iraq. It was Libya. It was Yemen. It was, oh my gosh, so many countries. Anyway, that's pretty interesting stuff, I think, and I think it's again, I'm not saying it's related to what's going on, but what I am saying is it's good to have, that 30,000 foot perspective on a variety of things as we look at what is taking place and try and make sense of it through the lens of common sense. I wish you guys could see me right now. I'm talking into the microphone and I'm like holding my hands in the air, trying to like narrate with my hands. I feel like Ja Rule.
Come on.
All right, the next thing I want to talk about today, and we're going to give Jon Stewart a cameo appearance. And this really goes along with, what we're talking about fiscal spending and, whether it's destabilizing economies to then rebuild them or, these omnibus spending bills that hopefully now is on everybody's radar. But, the fact is there is just a tremendous amount of money that is being spent, and it's been spent for a long time. And especially when it comes to our military. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the fact that we have a super strong military, and that's amazing. And I actually love watching videos of these planes and aircraft carriers and all that. It's super cool. But there's a lot of waste in that. And so give this a listen. This was an interview that he did with a lady that works for the Defense Department, I believe. And this was on C-SPAN. And it's really good. It's really good. I think Jon Stewart does a really nice job here asking her questions and then letting her reply and then continuing the conversation. So give this a listen.
Do you feel like these are unfair questions of somebody within a department of that size and scope?
I think you have a particular thing you really want to talk about and you're asking me other questions, but I don't think it's unfair to ask me about the audit. It's absolutely the case that the United States military should be able to pass an audit, and we've got to be on that pathway to get there.
But don't you think that does speak to the larger point that we're trying to get at, which is good journalism uncovers corruption? And
okay, good journalism does uncover corruption, but I'm not sure these two things are linked. An audit is not.
But they are.
Okay, so you need to explain to me, do you understand what an audit does and the degree to which it is linked to the question that you're asking?
I believe so.
Okay, go ahead. Give me your explanation.
No, I don't mind learning. So what I would suggest is that the audit that they have in the military doesn't really look at whether or not there's efficacy. It's just whether they got delivered the thing that they ordered. And
that is any audit. That is any audit. That is true.
But generally, those audits aren't $400 billion for Raytheon and $1.7 trillion for a plane that doesn't seem to be doing. Like, there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse within a system.
Audits and waste, fraud, and abuse are not the same thing. So let's decompose these pieces.
Please educate me on
sure.
What
so an audit is exactly what you just described, which is, do I know what was delivered to which place?
Right.
The ability to pass an audit or the fact that the DoD has not passed an audit is not suggestive of waste, fraud, and abuse. That is completely false right there. So
what is
now is a question of, it's suggestive that we don't have an accurate inventory that we can pull up of what we have where. That is not the same as saying we can't do that because waste, fraud, and abuse has occurred.
So in my world, that's waste.
How is that waste?
If I give you $1 billion and you can't tell me what happened to it, that to me is wasteful. That means you are not responsible. But if you can't tell me where it went, then what am I supposed to think? And when there has been reporting, I mean, this is not, look, I'm not saying this is on you and that you caused this, but I think it's a tough argument to make that.
I'm pretty sure I didn't cause it.
an $850 billion budget to an organization that can't pass an audit and tell you where that money went, like, I think most people would consider that somewhere in the realm of waste, fraud, or abuse, because they would wonder why that money isn't well accounted for. And especially when they see food insecurity on military bases, and they see.
You want to talk about that? Because that's a good. We should be talking. I mean, I'm trying to understand where you're trying to go, other than the dollars, which really bother you.
I think it doesn't really bother me. I think it's all connected.
Okay.
I think
tell me that story. Tell me how you're thinking about that.
When I see a State Department get a certain amount of money and a military budget be 10 times that, and I see a struggle within government to get people like more basic services, and then that department that got that, I mean, we got out of 20 years of war and the Pentagon got a $50 billion raise. Like, that's shocking to me. Now, I may not understand exactly the ins and outs and the incredible magic of an audit, but I'm a human being who lives on the earth and can't figure out how $850 billion to a department means that the rank and file still have to be on food stamps. Like, to me, that's fucking corruption. I'm sorry. And if that blows your mind, and if you think like that's like a crazy agenda for me to have, I really think that that's institutional thinking, and that it's not looking at the day-to-day reality of the people that you call the greatest fighting force in the world. So I get back to this idea of like, I'm not looking to pick a fight with you, but I am surprised at that the reaction to these questions are, you don't know what an audit is, bucko. Like, that's just weird to me.
The video of that is even better. It's on my personal Instagram, the @DeepShallowDive Instagram. It's also on the @DeepShallowDive Facebook page and on the @DeepShallowDive TikTok account. It's really good. I mean, it's actually very interesting to watch the video because that way you see her body language, and I truly feel like body language tells you so many things, and you sort of see the smirks on her face and all that. You could tell she was not happy with the direction of that conversation. But I thought Jon Stewart handled himself perfectly. He did drop an F-bomb at the end. I was a little surprised at that, but he nailed it. I mean, the military has failed their audit 5 times in a row over the past many years. And you're talking about $850 billion. And then I think it was like $1.7 trillion with, defense contractors that can't be audited properly. I mean, if there ever was a time for me to say shucky ducky quack quack, that would be it. The other thing with Jon Stewart, he also mentioned the 20-year war. Vincent talked about that. So you've heard that several times. And again, I'm just bringing that up because this stuff needs to, we've got to learn lessons from the past, or at least be cognizant of what took place in the past as we're trying to figure out the present and future. And, when I talk about it, when Vincent talks about it, when Charlie Kirk talks about it, when Jon Stewart talks about it. You like how I just lumped myself in with all those guys? But, there's truth in that. There's truth in that. And, the people that don't talk about it are the mainstream media. They're not out there screaming at the top of their lungs, hey, by the way, America, remember, we went into Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. We didn't find any. But we spent 20 years there and Afghanistan. We lumped the two together. It was $4 trillion. And at the end of it, we're just going to return that to the Taliban. You don't hear that from the news outlets. All right, I know we've gone in a couple different directions this episode, but there is a fundamental thread that, basically goes through everything. And that thread is money and power and greed. Really the three of them are linked together, but everything we've talked about, all has that common thread. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit, and this is a little bit funny, but I'm not going to take credit for this because I don't think that I'm big enough yet that I hit any of these guys' radars. But I will say, after my episode a couple episodes ago where I played the Islamic Terrorists for Dummies audios. Well, they were videos that I transferred into audio. But after I played that terrorist organization for dummies, man, every one I watch, they talk about that. So I'm not going to mention their names, although I will play this clip from Buck Sexton. But a lot of people are saying, oh, let's help you understand Hamas versus Al-Qaeda versus the Taliban versus ISIS or whatever. And the one thing I'm noticing that I did not do actually is they're basically trying to, I guess, relate them all to each other. And again, as goofy as this sounds, they all are different and they have different agendas. You know, right now it's really Hezbollah and Hamas. I mean, Hamas is the one you've heard about, and then Hezbollah is much bigger and they're much more powerful and they're based in Lebanon. Those are the two that, you know, have major problems with Israel, not Al-Qaeda. But listen to what some of the media is doing.
What has fundamentally happened here is on a moral plane. Hamas is indistinguishable from Al-Qaeda. Hamas is indistinguishable from ISIS. And all these people that are chanting and banging the drums and saying, oh, settlers in Israel and all this stuff, whatever, they are living in a parallel universe where that conclusion is not what everyone is coming to, because that is the reality. Hamas is, as Netanyahu has said, the same plane as ISIS, same plane as Al-Qaeda. And we know how we in America feel about ISIS and about Al-Qaeda.
So again, to me, that's like they're relating Hamas for everybody to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And again, they're all bad. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is this is like word association where the unfamiliarity with Hamas, now you can just say, hey, they're like Al-Qaeda. Remember 9/11? Yeah, it's those guys. You know what I mean? And that's happening. And again, when I hear stuff like that, and when you're paying attention and you do understand the differences and understand that, you know, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, they've never had or went after Israel. It's Hamas and Hezbollah, but obviously it's easier just to group all five together if that's what you want to portray. You know, that's being done. That was Buck Sexton. He's Clay Travis's partner. Honestly, gosh, I hate to keep picking on those two guys because I genuinely have liked them, but I think their takes are just wrong in this whole situation. Or even if they're not wrong, they're just they're not factual, and you can tell they don't really research things properly because they know the listener has no clue. You know, so it's like they're just firing up their base. They're basically like preaching to the choir and telling the choir what they want to hear. Whereas I feel like you always have to try and look at both sides of every situation. And, you know, again, there will be right and wrong, and you will at some point make a decision on who you think is, I guess, correct and who you think is not. But prior to getting into that, you've got to look at things from every angle. And sometimes with these guys, I just don't see it right now. All right, the next thing I want to play is I received this from maybe 6 different people. And, you know, it's so interesting how things go viral and then all of a sudden everybody gets it. But this is a clip from former President Jimmy Carter. And this is from roughly 10 years ago. Has he died yet, or is he? No, I think he's in hospice. Anyway, give this a listen from former Democratic President Jimmy Carter.
No doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid. The occupation of Palestinian land, the confiscation of that land that doesn't belong to Israel, the building of settlements on it, the colonization of that land, and then the connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupied territories is under the occupation forces is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know. And I think
even worse though than a place like Rwanda.
Yes, I think yes. You mean now?
Yes.
Yeah. I think.
All right, I'm gonna have to find that original entire interview because, man, I didn't realize everything he talked about in that. I downloaded that to my phone, and to be honest, I think for some reason maybe I didn't listen to it fully, but there was a lot to unpack in that. So you know what? I'm gonna put a pin in that as the expression goes, and come back to that because I think there's a lot he said in there. And again, that's former President Jimmy Carter. I mean, you know, I will say there's so much confusion and so much, I guess, ambiguity on a lot of things. But just like I played President Harry Truman's speech in 1948, I mean, if you're going to believe anybody, I can't even believe I'm saying this. Maybe I shouldn't say this. I mean, a president is probably privy to more information than the normal public, right? So again, I don't know. Oh, speaking of presidents, I totally forgot. So Obama came out with a statement on his Instagram. I think it was 2 days ago. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going to read it real quick. Okay, holy mackerel. We're going to have to come back to that and unpack that as well. But if you want to read some interesting comments, go to Barack Obama's Instagram. He posted it. It's like 5 pages basically. And then read those comments. They're fascinating. And then secondly, if you have more time to kill and you are on TikTok, type in Obama Palestine and watch some of these people's TikToks about his 5-page speech. It's pretty interesting. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I will say it talks about Al-Qaeda, you know, and again, it makes that connection. And then it does seem to, which I'll agree with this, it seems to kind of try to get Netanyahu to slow his roll a little bit and basically not move so fast with all of this ground invasion talk, and really just is kind of advocating for Netanyahu and Israel to pump the brakes, which is really what the United Nations has been trying to say. Because if you think about it, you know, obviously Hamas struck the first blow on October 7th, but basically everything you've heard since then, as far as like bombings and casualties and all of that, has been Israel on the offensive. And so now, you know, if you look at the death totals, I think it's roughly 1,400 on the Israeli side. And again, it looks like those were all on, or maybe not all, but most were on October 7th. That's what they're being attributed to. And then on the Palestinian side, we're approaching 6,000. Actually, here, let me read it to you directly off of Reuters. It says, Israel has bombarded the besieged Gaza Strip relentlessly since October 7th, when Hamas launched a surprise attack on southern Israel, killing at least 1,400 people, according to Israeli authorities. After the attack, Israel cut off supplies of water, food, fuel, and electricity to the enclave's 2.3 million residents, an act the UN has called a form of collective punishment. It also launched an assault on the territory, killing at least 5,791 people. More than 1 million people have been displaced as Israel ordered residents of northern Gaza to evacuate to the south, but Israeli air raids have continued throughout the territory. That's what we were talking about the other day. Again, I forget which episode, where they basically, you know, told you have 24 hours, you should evacuate, a million people from the north to the south. And I used the analogy of what if Nevada told the state of California that the 3 million person population in Los Angeles had to relocate to Orange County. I mean, that's insane. So, you know, based on what this Reuters article is saying, and by the way, I looked it up in other ones because I don't trust anybody, and they're all pretty much echoing that same sentiment. It's kind of like, you know, if you're going to do an eye for an eye, I mean, when does that stop? You know, right now it seems like the Palestinians have endured 4 times the amount of killings. Again, according to those numbers, I mean, I don't know where those numbers come from, so I'm not going to vouch for anything on either side. But according to those numbers, which these major media publications are publishing, you know, it's approaching 6,000 versus that same 1,400. So anyway, the Secretary General of the UN came out to address this, and listen to what he says.
We also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
All right, so remember the term collective punishment. Now, that was not very well received on the Israeli side, and so, by the way, that guy's name is Antonio Guterres, and he is the Secretary General of the UN. And so after that, the Israeli ambassador Gilad Erdan, I'm assuming the ambassador to the UN, accused him of, quote unquote, justifying terrorism and called for his immediate resignation. So let me play his clip.
It's a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign, because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building. This building was established to prevent atrocities. How can the Secretary General, with his words, justify in any way the terrible atrocities that happened to our civilians, innocent civilians?
All right, I didn't want to comment till I played all of them because the Secretary General did not take kindly to that statement by the Israeli UN ambassador, and so he fired back. But, the one thing I did want to say is, I understand where he was coming from, and again, 1,400 innocent civilians is awful, but by the same token, on the other side, again, let's call a spade. We're at 6,000 innocent civilians. They're not reporting these Palestinians that are dying as being Hamas. They're innocent Palestinians. And if you don't believe me, I said it before and I'll say it again. Go to Shaun King's, SHAUN King's Instagram page. Again, I'm not even that much of a fan of Shaun King's. I haven't really agreed with a lot of the things he said. He's actually under fire for a lot of different stuff. Supposedly, he lied about a relationship with some hostages got released. Honestly, I don't even know the truth to that story because I didn't look into it. Because again, for me, the thing about him that I respect is that he's showing actual footage. And so, again, if you want to see what's going on the Palestinian side as far as the casualties, like I said, go to his page and then see if you can stomach it and then come back and talk to me. But all right, let's listen to Senor Guterres' response, as like I said, he did not take too kindly to the previous clip.
I am shocked by the misrepresentations by some of my statement yesterday in the Security Council, as if I was justifying acts of terror by Hamas. This is false. It was the opposite. In the beginning of my intervention yesterday, I clearly stated, and I quote, I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians or the launching of rockets against civilian targets. End quote. Indeed, I spoke of the grievances of the Palestinian people. And in doing so, I also clearly stated, and I quote, "But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas," end quote. And then I went on with my intervention, referring all my positions on all aspects of the Middle East crisis. I believe it was necessary to set the record straight, especially out of respect to the victims and to their families.
All right. I'm going to have to agree with the UN Secretary General. You can go back and listen, press like 15 seconds 4 or 5 times and go back and listen. You know, he clearly did condemn Hamas, and, you know, he did lay out his perspective of what's taken place with the Palestinian people for the past 56 years. And so, you know, just because that's not what you want to hear, you know, you can't, well, you can, and he did. But again, I don't really find merit in somebody calling for the other person's resignation just because they say what you don't want to hear. You know, right now, you know, this was probably the gist of Obama's 5-page Instagram post, which we're going to come back to because I want to read it a lot more closely in a couple times. And I'm actually going to try and throw that into 11 Labs and see if I can play that for you guys. But, you know, Doctors Without Borders, these guys came out with a post, and it says, Doctors Without Borders, immediate ceasefire. We are calling for an immediate ceasefire and lifting the siege to allow increased and continuous humanitarian supplies to cross into Gaza. That's from Doctors Without Borders, which, I mean, again, everybody, I think, respects them. You've got the International Red Cross. They posted on their Instagram. It says, hospitals face impossible conditions, no power, operations by flashlight, no painkillers. Supplies are at the limit. Medical teams need reinforcements. Doctors are now treating injured doctors. When hospitals are asked to evacuate, not everyone can leave. Patients tied to a hospital bed are not able to simply move. The rules of war are clear. Hospitals must be protected. Healthcare workers must be allowed to work safely. Hospitals are not a target. So that's on ICRC, the International Red Cross Committee. Obviously, we heard from the United Nations via the Secretary General. You know, they posted on their Instagram as well to, you know, call for an immediate ceasefire. The last one I'll read you is from Amnesty International, their global account, but then all their country accounts echoed the same thing. It says, demand a ceasefire to end civilian suffering. Sign our petition to call for an immediate ceasefire by all parties to end civilian bloodshed and ensure humanitarian aid access to Gaza. So basically, all these humanitarian organizations that, again, everybody loves and respects, you know, they're all saying the same thing. And obviously, that to me shows that there is a problem and supplies are not being let into Gaza. Now, the one thing I will say, and I need to research this a little more, is, you know, I don't understand why things can't go through Egypt, because Gaza does share a border or a little bit of their border with Egypt. If you haven't looked it up on a map yet, basically Gaza is like, think about it as like the letter L, and then the long part of the L from top to bottom, that shares a border with Israel, and then the little part at the bottom that goes horizontal, that's what shares a border with Egypt. So the vertical part shares with Israel, the horizontal part shares with Egypt. So I'll have to look that up. I don't quite understand or know what the deal is there and why they can't basically use that access. So you heard from the humanitarian agencies, and here's what the world leaders are saying. So I'm going to play you a clip from British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. I'm not a big fan of this dude. Actually, I'm not a fan of any of these prime ministers for Britain. They went from the dude from Dumb and Dumber to this guy. So I guess it is Dumb and Dumber. But give a listen to Rishi Sunak's interview, and it looks like this was after he met with Netanyahu.
Do you feel any sympathy for the innocent Palestinians, many of whom have no affiliation to Hamas whatsoever, who may lose their lives because of this? And when you spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu, did you raise any concerns?
Well, we're monitoring the situation very closely. We have formally updated our travel advice, and of course humanitarian concerns and protection of civilians are very important, and if this is something that I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu about late last night, it's also why we've moved Royal Navy assets into the Mediterranean over the coming week, and they will be able to provide humanitarian support if required.
We're seeing a blockade of food, medicine and water to Gaza in what some are saying is potentially a breach of international law. Are you okay with Israel potentially committing war crimes? And are you providing full moral support regardless of what Israel does?
It's important to remember why we're in this very difficult situation, and that's because Hamas, a prescribed terrorist organization.
All right, sorry, I had to interject. Just pay attention to what he's saying. I mean, he gets asked a specific question and he completely deflects it and takes it in another direction, with Hamas. I mean, he's been asked twice now about the innocent Palestinian civilians, both at the beginning and then now here, and he literally deflected both of those. I think he's going to come back and answer it, but still, answer the initial question. Here, I'm going to save you 15-second rewind so that listen to this part again and then it'll continue.
We're seeing a blockade of food, medicine and water to Gaza in what some are saying is potentially a breach of international law. Are you okay with Israel potentially committing war crimes? And are you providing full moral support regardless of what Israel does?
It's important to remember why we're in this very difficult situation, and that's because Hamas, a prescribed terrorist organization, committed an appalling act of barbarity and has killed over 1,000 Israelis, including women and children.
All right, really quick. He says over 1,000. The number's 1,400. Why don't you say 1,400? I thought that was weird that he said over 1,000 when it's 1,400. That's not like 1,005. 1,400 is 40% more than what you just said.
In scenes that are quite frankly horrific and that we haven't seen in decades. It is unequivocally wrong, and there is no moral ambiguity about that. Israel has every right to defend itself and take the action that is necessary to ensure protection and security of its citizens, and that nothing like this can ever happen again.
Even if some of those actions are not in line with international law?
No, of course we should always, and we are always, having concerns of civilians.
All right, that was that. Again, think what you want about that. Personally, I thought that was very unbecoming of a prime minister. Obviously, Great Britain and Israel are linked from 1948, so it actually probably isn't that surprising. All right, I know this is long, but it's Friday. You've got all weekend. You can break this up into pieces, listen to it twice, 3 times. Probably should. Anyway, all right. I know we jumped around a lot this episode, talked about a variety of things. Let me know if you liked it. Seriously, let me know if this was, maybe a better way to do it versus a singular topic. Obviously, again, I think there's a thread that connects all these, but let me know your thoughts. Also, again, follow us on Facebook. We've got a great page there. Instagram at Deep Shallow Dive, TikTok at Deep Shallow Dive, all the socials. We also have our website, deepshallowdive.com. You can find everything there and also listen through your browser. If you do not listen on a podcast player, you can listen to every episode through the browser. And then there's some cool, blog material on there. We're really building this out to a community. If you get a chance, throw your boy a nice review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And then I'm going to have more things coming here pretty soon. Okay, the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and basically I'm going to say my goodbye now, and it's going to finish once this clip plays, but a lot of you probably know Fareed Zakaria. He is actually, kind of like Mehdi Hassan, one of the big reporters on a variety of different networks. He's got his own show, very, very popular guy. My cousin Maz sent me this clip. And then he sent me a picture of the two of them arm in arm, like a couple bros. So I was like, all right, I'll give it a listen. And I did. And honestly, I really liked it. I thought it was very insightful. I think what he has to say makes a lot of sense. So I am going to leave you with that, everybody. All right, call a spade, give this a listen. Have a wonderful weekend, and you will most likely hear from me again on Monday, possibly on Tuesday, but hopefully on Monday. All right, give a listen.
Here's my take. Hamas's brutal and inhuman attack on Israel last week took the world by surprise. Most importantly and tragically, it took the Israeli government by surprise, which meant a delayed response to the slaughter of its civilians. But this was no black swan event. Instead, as the scholar Amy Ziegart notes, it was a white swan, something utterly predictable. This is the fifth war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza over the last 15 years. Israel controls air, land, and sea access to the Strip. Israeli intelligence is supposed to have an extensive network of informants in Gaza. So what happened? We'll need time to reach a full assessment, but it does appear that the Netanyahu government was so focused on judicial overhaul at home and a Saudi deal abroad that it ignored the possibility of an upheaval in Gaza, despite allegedly receiving warnings from Egypt. Professor Dmitry Shumsky of Hebrew University writes more provocatively that for years Netanyahu developed and advanced a destructive, warped political doctrine that held that strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority would be good for Israel. This approach divided the Palestinians, undermined the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and made it easy for Netanyahu to claim there was no path to a Palestinian state. Shumsky cites a Jerusalem Post report that at a Likud party meeting in 2019, Netanyahu made clear that he supported the money that the Qatari government was sending to Hamas. That way, Bibi is reported to have said, Israel would foil the establishment of a Palestinian state. Tal Schneider references the same meeting and also notes that most of the time Israeli policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as an asset, like Israel's current finance minister once asserted. The Netanyahu government was pursuing a policy premised on the notion that it could ignore the Palestinian issue and make a deal directly with the Gulf Arabs, who were increasingly nervous about Iran's rise in the region and eager to tie up with Israel's booming technology-driven economy. The assumptions behind that strategy exploded last week. But there is a broader backdrop for last week's terror attack. For the last 2 decades, the Middle East has been shaped by Washington's actions, above all by the Iraq War and the subsequent withdrawal of American power. The war upset the delicate balance between Iran and the Arabs and the Shiites and the Sunnis. When the US toppled Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated government in Baghdad, Iran gained unprecedented influence in Iraq, which is majority Shia. Then began the American retreat from the Middle East, which left a vacuum in the region into which many players entered: Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Israel, each trying to promote its own interests. We think of the world as having been reasonably stable for these last 2 decades until Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But that is not true of the Middle East, where the last 2 decades have been particularly bloody. Hundreds of thousands died in Iraq. Then came the Syrian civil war, which displaced more than 14 million people and killed still more hundreds of thousands. That was followed by a war in Yemen, which quickly became the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And in all of these crises and conflicts, regional players have picked sides, trying to maximize their advantages and bleed their foes. We're seeing a worldwide contest between the forces of order and disorder. Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas are trying to erode the international system. If Hamas succeeds, it will encourage others, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to flex their muscles as well. Defeating Hamas is a daunting challenge. That terrorist group is hoping for a massive Israeli overreaction that produces thousands of civilian casualties and bogs down Israeli troops. Hamas is also hoping for the collapse of any possible deal with Saudi Arabia. The more brutal Israel's response, the more likely it is that that deal will collapse. Israel's goal should be to respond to Hamas, deal with the Palestinian issue in a way that still allows for the resumption of negotiations on Saudi normalization. That is the strategic prize. The establishment of normal relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia would be the severest setback for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. One lesson is clear. The United States cannot walk away from the Middle East entirely. It can forswear military interventions, and it can recognize the centrality of Asia, but it needs to remain politically and diplomatically active in the region. American engagement is a stabilizing force in the world. For those unconvinced, look at the emerging post-American Middle East. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week.
This episode was brought to you by Boost Liquid Vitamins. Wake up, take your Boost, start your day. Drink your vitamins, build your immune system with Boost. Available on Boost.com.